Hello and welcome to another episode of The State of Politics. Today we are delighted to be joined by Green candidate Kate Nevens. I'm your host Declan McConville. Again, I'm joined by my usual co-host Patrick McGill. Patrick, how are you?
I'm well. How are you, Declan?
I'm fine. We're starting to the restrictions are easing every week, so there's a wee bit more light at the end of the tunnel. So, Kate, how are you doing? And could you just give us a wee background on yourself? Obviously, you're running for Holyrood 2021. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you've arrived at this point?
Sure. So I'm Kate Nevens. I'm one of the list candidates for the Scottish Greens in Lothian. I grew up in a place called Norwich down south, which was used to be best known for being the home to Alan Partridge and Coleman's Mustard. It's not the best, perhaps, but now we're also known to be hometown of Bimini Von Boulash from UK Drag Race. So I feel like Norwich is going up in the world. I first came to Scotland as a student back in 2001. Then I left. I spent time working between the UK and the Middle East for about 10 years. And then 5 years ago, I came back and made Edinburgh my permanent home. And one of the first things I did when I came back to Edinburgh was join the Scottish Greens. I was already a member of the England and Wales Greens, but I thought it might actually be a nice way of meeting some people and making some friends. How I got involved.
Good stuff. So what would you say sparked your interest in politics, and what made you choose the Green Party out of all the other political parties across the UK?
Yeah, sure. So I've always been really interested in activist politics rather than perhaps party politics, if that makes sense. So from a very young age, I was very interested in, I grew up in a very Labour household, actually, where a lot of the chat was anti-Thatcher on a day-to-day basis. But I wasn't really aware of the party politics behind that, but I understood sort of some of the things that my family had faced, a lot of my family from mining towns in the northeast of England. And I was also probably one of the really formative things in my late teens was the Iraq War. So I went to the massive marches in Glasgow when I was a student here, and that was probably what tipped me into sort of global social justice issues.
Kate,
and then,
yeah. No, sorry, on you go.
I can say I got interested. I got vaguely interested in party politics, but I wasn't really sure which party. I sort of felt like I was naturally Labour, but I didn't seem to agree with them all much during the Blair years. And I did a bunch of those tests online. You know, when you like answer 100 different questions on what you think about policy. And I did them a few times, and I came out 95 to 99% Green every single time I did them. And I was like, hang on, there might be something in this. I think I might have found a political party that I share a lot of values with. So actually, that's probably how I came to Green politics, is realizing that my own values and politics meshed so closely with a party that didn't get that much media time. So I didn't know that much about the Greens.
Kate, you mentioned the Labour Party there being quite prominent in your early years and growing up. Why do you think even now in Scottish politics we saw such a switch from a lot of people probably voting Labour in the past to voting Green, and a lot of more people aligning with the Greens?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between elements of the Labour Party, probably the sort of left, sort of socialist side of the Labour Party, and Green politics. And I think some people are shifting across parties, but other people are staying, but then will be people that we work with in Parliament, right? So it's not. I'm still, I guess, still not like intensely party political. There's a lot of things that I share with the Green Party, but I would be more than happy if I was elected to work with SNP, Labour, Lib Dems on. There are definitely things that we share. I think the Greens have been banging on about the climate emergency, right, for years. And I think it's now, thanks to the youth climate strikers, I would say, I think that was the big turning point. It's now hit public consciousness, and I think there are a lot of environmentally aware people in other parties that have realised that actually now maybe this is the priority, and that the Greens are the party that are putting forward the most practical, actually, the most practical things we can do to start addressing it.
You were saying about how you came back 5 years ago to Scotland and joined the Scottish Green Party. 5 years ago, Jeremy Corbyn would have been Labour leader, and you say you're inspired by political movements and campaigning. Was there ever a temptation to join the Labour Party under Corbyn? I know you didn't want to join it under Blair for obvious reasons, but was there ever a temptation under Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes, I have my differences, and with some of the things that Corbyn, the ways that Corbyn chose to deal with the Labour Party, but that manifesto that he brought out was a really, really, in my opinion, a really, really strong manifesto. And I know I never had any inclination to join the party, but the Greens don't always run in every seat. So I think there was a possibility of me voting for Labour rather than Greens, and I would have. I was slightly torn, to be honest, between voting for the Labour Party manifesto that I thought was a good manifesto for the UK. It was a good progressive, and it had some good stuff on the environment in as well. When I wasn't able to vote Green, but also my local Labour candidate, who was not a supporter of many things in that manifesto. So I was torn, and then I ran. So I was like, so in the last general election in 2019, the snap general election, it would have been the same issue. So I put myself forward and I ran so that there was a Green option, and I could get those Green ideas into the debates that were happening with a Labour Party sitting MP that didn't share those.
So Kate, you mentioned Westminster there, and the Green influence at Westminster. How important a figure do you think Caroline Lucas has been in recent years at Westminster?
I mean, I think Caroline's amazing. She's an absolutely incredible woman. But how much are you able to do as an individual? Like, the Green movement is a collective movement, and it's in a first past the post system in Westminster. A smaller party is always going to struggle to get MPs, but it's not just that. The culture of Westminster is so different. It's to the culture of the Scottish Parliament. So the Scottish Parliament was set up to have a system where ideally you don't end up with a majority government. So there has to be more collaborative politics here. Whereas Westminster is the exact opposite, right? Where everyone just is in it for the win only and not for what you can do through constructive opposition. So there's unlike Caroline, who obviously would want to be working in constructive opposition, perhaps that's not how the Labour Party works down south in terms of working with others. Whereas it is how people work here, which is part of the reason why I moved here, actually, is just that the politics here feels so different and so much more accessible, and so much, it's not perfect by any means, but it does feel like you could get a lot done as a smaller party. Like, we've got our Green MSP group. We've had currently in the outgoing group, it's 5 MSPs. The amount of things they've managed to do as a small group in Scottish Parliament. Like, we've banned winter evictions by landlords. We've made sure that that health workers and education workers get regular COVID testing. We've got pandemic payments to the most vulnerable families. Like, we've managed to negotiate. We've even negotiated a fairer tax system where the rich are paying more income tax and those of us who earn less are paying less. So, like, there's really massive things that we've been able to do just as a small party, and that's less true, I think, down in Westminster. But it's so good having her voice. She does cut through, even just as one person. Like, it's yeah.
Yeah, the sort of semicircle that we have, or the semi-oval that we have in the Scottish Parliament, is a lot better than the two swords length than at Westminster.
Yeah, and also all the, I don't know whether, I think they've stopped it now, but the horrible like jeering, it's all really sexist as well, right? So you've got like people making quite sexist, I'm not going to repeat them on here, but like what the male MPs do in Westminster when a woman speaks is disgusting. And yeah, it's like a baying bunch of public school boys, and it's horrific. It's horrific.
It's quite embarrassing as well when you actually listen to
it. Yeah, I have quite a lot of friends. So my work background is working internationally, and I have quite a lot of friends who occasionally ask me about systems of parliament. It's embarrassing to just explain anything about Westminster. It's also archaic and nonsense. So yeah, it's much nicer now I live in Scotland and I can talk about Scottish politics.
100%. So with this election coming up, the Greens are calling it the most important election in our lifetime because of the climate and how we've got something like 9 years to get to net zero emissions. Do you think this is the most important election of our lifetime?
Yeah, I mean, 100% yes. So yes, the scientists are telling us that we've got 9 years left to reverse the climate emergency. And what that means is we need to be taking action now, not in 9 years' time. So we need to be taking action now. And this next parliament that we'll be voting in May, they'll be sitting for over half of those 9 years. So it's not something that can wait. And we also know, we talk about the climate crisis as if maybe like it's an impending crisis rather than something that's happening right now. My day job is working with on human rights and equality issues here in Scotland, but also working with youth and women activists in other parts of the world. One of the countries I spent a bit of time in is South Sudan. And what you're looking at in South Sudan is communities who are already being displaced. So they're having to flee their homes because of climate change. They have lost all of their livelihoods. So if they work in agriculture or cow farming, they've lost their livelihoods due to flooding. And you're also seeing climate change in South Sudan driving conflict. So this is something that's happening to communities elsewhere now. We know that Indonesia is moving its capital city before it sinks. I'm sure you guys are aware, but like half of the world was on fire a couple of years ago. So you had Brazil was on fire, Australia was on fire, the Arctic of all places. You can tell I'm not a scientist. But how the hell was the Arctic on fire? The Arctic was on fire. So it's happening on mass scales elsewhere, but it's also happening here. We're seeing the warmest ever summers and winters on record. We're seeing huge amounts of flooding. We know that the housing down at Portobello probably are going to have to, like the seafront housing is probably going to have to be destroyed to make way for sea defences in the next 10 years. So yeah, we talk about it as a crisis, but it's a current crisis. It's not an impending crisis. And yeah, we think that to be part of the global collective action that is needed, the Scottish government needs to take this incredibly seriously. And the more Green MSPs we can get into Parliament in this election, the more likely it is that we will be able to push through really serious plans to tackle the climate emergency from Scotland and with our allies around the world.
Keep mentioning the Scottish Government there. How do you assess their 14 years in governments to tackle this? Has it been too little? And do you think there's a big difference in contrast and response from the Scottish Government, who have set some quite high targets but not fulfilled them compared to Westminster?
Yeah, so it's getting better. It's obviously good that the Scottish Government declared a climate emergency. That was a good step in the right direction. We also have a climate emergency bill, which is a step in the right direction, and some, as you say, some really ambitious targets. But we're still, that's not enough. Ambitious targets are not enough, and I do not believe that the Scottish Government have put in the plans to properly meet those targets. I also don't think that they entirely have the political will to properly move away from oil and gas. So they're not alone in this. I think all of the other major parties are still really committed to road building. So one of the things you mentioned you might like to talk about later is transport. But one of the things we really need to do is move investment into green public transport and away from road building. So the biggest emissions in Scotland come from transport. And you're looking at a bunch of parties that are really happy, like being photographed on bicycles, but then they'll put a whole load of money into road building. So I think the Conservatives are spending 27 billion building 4,000 miles of new road. Labour are committed to an urban motorway in London, I think. But the SNP have continued their road building. We've managed in negotiation to get some of that road building investment into other things, but they're continuing their road building plans in Scotland. And I believe that they've just committed in that last budget to £155 million worth of new roads in Scotland. And we're also the only party, so they've got ambitious targets, which we will constructively support to try and get them to be met. But there's still not a firm enough commitment from other parties to completely ending extraction of oil and gas. We're the only party that's calling for an immediate revoking and ending of licensing for exploration, which is something that New Zealand has just done. So it is definitely feasible. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of vested interests. There's a lot of conversations between fossil fuel lobbying companies and the outgoing Scottish government. We know that I think the Scottish government were having meetings with fossil fuel lobbyists on the day that we voted through the climate emergency bill. So yeah, there's still a lot to do in terms of like wrestling people away from this idea that we need to be this committed to oil and gas.
You mentioned there about transport. The Greens have committed to Rail for All, I believe it's called, sort of expanding not only services but actually train lines where you can travel to and from. How important do you think that is in tackling the climate emergency? And also, how do you think you bring working class voices who would use public transport into the conversation and into the sort of field of study?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I think it's, like I say, transport's actually the biggest carbon emitter in Scotland. So it's really, really crucial that we get our energy efficient, green, carbon zero transport in Scotland, and nationalising the railways and expanding the railways is a really, really important part of that. But part of that is also making that affordable. So we would, instead of subsidising our roads and our fossil fuel industry, we move some of those subsidies into public transport, and that would be what makes that much, much, much more affordable. We're also looking at free bus travel. So one of the things the Greens did was bring in free bus travel for under 22s, which is starting this summer, but we'd be looking to expand that. And yeah, I think that's really important for working class families who need to use public transport, that it becomes free or minimum cost. It's also really important for lots of different groups of people. I was talking to someone who works on drug abuse in West Lothian, and one of the big problems for people that are seeking support for drug abuse is that all the centres are in the urban centres, or in the city centres. So you need to get from your home into the city centre, and you just can't afford to do that. You can't. It sounds maybe not like something that would like maybe you or I would think about paying. I can't remember. Is it £1.75 for? It's sometimes 75 in Edinburgh for a bus. But that's a lot if you're destitute. So making sure that bus travel is free for those that need it is really, really, really important.
while you're talking about transport there, Kate, another green policy is to ban new petrol and diesel cars by 2026. Why do you think that's important? Obviously, you've already touched on roads there, but why do you think it's important that we put an end to so much production in cars and we start to use public transport? Because on that note, I was in Luxembourg last year and I saw the difference that free public transport coming into force there is going to make, because even from a tourist perspective, it's fantastic because the ease of access. We stayed at the airport in Luxembourg. Obviously, it's not very big as a country, but just to be able to freely roam about from airport into city centre via public transport is just fantastic. And I think it's something that everybody would benefit of. I think you would see a lot more people using public transport, as well as that for young people like myself and Patrick that both go to university. He doesn't live in the city centre. Our university is in the city centre. So in terms of that, it opens access to everything, not just education, but jobs. So why do you think this move to more public transport and banning diesel and petrol cars by 2026 is so imperative?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons. I think the move towards supporting public transport is an equalities issue. So there's also some countries, not countries like you were saying, that have moved towards a completely free transport system. There are also often the countries that have the most gender transformative policies. So the policies that are best for women. Not a lot of people think about women first when they think about transport. And you have, but you have countries like Sweden where they actually think about that. And what they do is they make sure that the pavements are safe and wide, because women tend to be doing the school runs and the work runs with buggies. And women make a lot less trips by car than men in most European countries. So actually, if you start thinking about things from an equality perspective, so young people, working class people, women, you actually find that car travel is not benefiting the majority of the country. So you actually need to think about that, and then think about those who do need to use cars. So in rural locations, how do we get the best form of public transport to them so that they have options? So I think the rail policy is that we would build a railway station or bring back a railway station into use, because we've actually got a lot of former railway stations, to anywhere with a population of over 5,000 people. So you'd actually start seeing much better access for your different groups of people. Although there's another thing around the banning of sales of new petrol and diesel cars, and that's air pollution, right? So in Edinburgh, where I live, we have 6 areas of the city where the levels of air pollution are illegal. They're incredibly dangerous. And we know that air pollution is bad air quality is actually killing people. It's a leading cause of heart disease, of strokes, of respiratory diseases. And we've actually started quite recently the first ever, so it's a bit miserable, but it's actually now been recorded that air pollution has been recorded on people's death certificates. We had the first death certificate that said that the cause of death here was air pollution. So we need to be cleaning up our air for our own health. So one of the things we do, as well as trying to reduce the use of petrol and diesel cars, is also introduce low emission zones in all areas that breach air quality limits immediately. And then we'd also be looking at a default 20 miles an hour limit in built up areas, which you can imagine is not just an air pollution thing, that's also a general traffic safety thing. So there's a whole bunch of things around reducing traffic and congestion and improving our quality of lives. And we do understand that also, if that's the sort of measures that we'll be taking, we need to make sure that the other options are there for people, so that the public transport is there and it's affordable, that you've got active travel, safe active travel routes, so places where you can walk, where you can cycle safely, where you can wheelchair safely, where you can push a buggy safely. One of the things I'm really excited about in our approach to this is also this idea of 15-minute neighborhoods. So 15-minute neighborhoods is where you have everything that you need, all your like essential services, shops within a short walk or cycle from your home. So you don't need to use a car, or you don't, and you ideally don't even need to use a bus. And actually understanding how people travel. There's an assumption that everyone's just getting in a car, but that's not true. People need buses. People use the buses. People use the trams. People cycle. People walk. So how can we get those neighbourhoods with your green spaces that you need for your mental health? How do you make sure that that's all sort of in our planning system?
You were saying earlier, before we move on to the rest of the manifesto, that you would work in the Middle East in your your old job. How disappointing is it with I think it's Saudi Arabia that they're still exploring for oil, and then also in places like Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro burning the Amazon basically, and especially in the global south, which I think is going to be mostly affected by climate change. How disappointing and how much of a factor is this in the fight against climate change?
And so there's a few things going on there. I think climate justice is really, really important. So when we're talking about the burning of the Amazon, that's also where people live. So we're not just talking about the destruction of environments like natural landscapes. We're talking about people's homes. And I think one of the unique things about the Green Party is that we have this global movement. So we have over 100 Green parties around the world. But we also have our environmental justice activists. Oh, not ours. We have environmental justice activists that are looped into the Green movement in every single country in the world, I would say. And that includes indigenous groups who have been fighting climate change and land justice issues for generations, including in places like the Amazon, including in places like Australia. It's really tied into land rights and capitalism, and how global companies and European and American countries go in and steal things from people. And that's intimately linked with the extraction of natural resources, as I'm sure we know. So we need to be listening to and learning from these communities that have been active on this for generations, because we know there's been huge successes. I mean, through really dangerous, risky activism that people have been doing. But people have been able to stop pipelines being laid, to stop further land being stolen from them. And yeah, I think one of the things about the Green Party is that we're very connected into that movement. So you mentioned Saudi, about sort of oil in Saudi. So one of my the countries that I've been working on for the last 12 years, I've been working with youth activists and women activists, is in Yemen. So we're not just supporting Saudi extraction of oil, we're also supporting, we're selling weapons to Saudi to use against civilians in Yemen, in huge violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. So that's also something that I would like to see completely stopped. And while weapons export licensing sits with the UK government, and I support independence, so I'd like to see that ultimately ended totally in Scotland. The Scottish government actually supports the weapons industry in Scotland a lot. So some of the weapons that Saudi are using in Yemen are manufactured here in Scotland. So there's smart bombs that are manufactured here in Scotland, and also parts of other parts of fighter jets and bombs. And the Scottish government uses public funds through their enterprise funds to support these companies, and that needs to be something that ends absolutely immediately.
I think I do remember Patrick Harvey mentioning that, the funding of Raytheon, I think it's called.
Yeah,
they've got some sort of base in Fife or something. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, they're in Grandmothers in Fife. Yeah. So those bombs have been used against Yemenis, but also against Palestinians in Gaza.
Kate, while we were talking about foreign powers and international issues there, in recent days we saw John Kerry make a trip to China. With the way we see both countries, the US and China, continue to, use fossil fuels, do you have any hope that we'll ever see these two countries start to change their ways? I mean, especially with the way China burn coal, and the same goes for the US with drilling and the coal as well. Do you ever think that we'll see both countries eventually start to bring down their emissions as the two biggest burners?
Yes, I do have hope. I think you have to have hope as much as anything else, because otherwise we are talking about the end of the world. I mean, there's no easy way of saying that, right? We have to globally, and we have to globally link those countries into our international agreements. I think we are seeing some positive moves coming out of America. So I think Biden, imperfect as he may be, I think he is moving in the right direction. He is investing in green infrastructure, which is good. I think we've also got some other countries we can look to see who's doing well at this. So the Germans have got a really impressive green recovery that they're seeding. The EU is making billions available to invest in the green recovery. South Korea has some are moving in the right direction. New Zealand, and then we've got all those little Pacific islands that are non-emitters, but are and their whole populations are going to go underwater, but they're really leading the way in terms of pushing for the right things to happen. So I think it's really about this collective movement. We don't need to think of us. So as Scotland, we're one of the biggest per capita emitters, and we're a wealthy nation that is emitting far more carbon than the majority of the world. But we need to act in concert with other countries, and globally we need to be addressing this.
One thing that the Scottish Government or the SNP have been talking about is a publicly owned energy company. And I think it's been in the works for about 3 years or so. I think I remember it being talked about in 2018. With the GMB strikes in British Gas in recent weeks and months, with the fire and rehire proposal that they're trying to give to the workers, how important is it for this to be sort of accelerated and brought in as quickly as possible, so that not only you can move to a sort of more progressive energy choice, but also treat workers fairly, pay them fairly, and make sure they're not mistreated?
Yeah, so really, really important. So we definitely support public ownership of energy, but also the Greens would go further, and we'd be looking to support community ownership of energy and community decision making around energy as well. Absolutely, this is linked to fair pay and conditions. So one of the things more broadly on fair pay and conditions, so currently living wage and zero contract hours and all the sort of legislation or regulation you'd want to bring in around those sits with Westminster. One of the things that we can do, and it's a big reason there's many big reasons for independence in my opinion, but it is like moving employment law to Scotland so that we can end insecure, underpaid, undervalued work. It's incredibly important. And I do not see the UK government going in that direction at all, as I say. So yes, but in the meantime, public ownership of of energy, of public transport is really important. And they're the areas, and also in sort of public sector workers are the areas where we can make sure that people are paid properly, and that they work in safe and healthy workplaces as well. And one of the things that the Greens are proposing in terms of that, in terms of getting more people living wage and secure contracts, and also making sure everyone can be unionized, is that we'd be proposing that any public contract, so when local government or national government contracts a company to provide care services, for example, that company needs to be unionized, and that company needs to be paying a living wage. So that would be an awful lot of, not everyone, so it wouldn't include all private sector, but that would include a lot of the large contractors in Scotland.
But while we're on jobs, Kate, obviously the Greens plan is to create jobs through a transition to net zero. The usual chat from the Tories and whatnot is that we're going to lose lots of jobs in oil and gas and it's going to be a crisis. What would your response be to that? That, you know, by moving to net zero, we can create more jobs and more sustainable jobs for the future?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely can. So I'm sure you've seen in our manifesto that we're saying that an investment-led recovery is really, really important. And it's what we then invest in. So we'd be investing in things like renewable energy, investing in warm, green homes, investing in restoring nature, which helps us capture some of the carbon, and investing in public transport, as we talked about. And those kinds of investments, they would lead to, we believe, at least 100,000 jobs being created. It would also lead to towards us being a net zero carbon country, and it would also make people's lives better at the same time. So it is about job. It is about you definitely can get not just jobs, but adequately paid jobs. We have the right people with the right technical skills for these jobs in Scotland already. So there's an awful lot of employment that can be created through this. In terms of a just transition, so making sure that when we stop extracting oil and gas from the North Sea, that those jobs are retained. We actually have a proposal to guarantee those workers jobs in the just transition, and also opportunities for training and reskilling, so that they can transition across to things like renewable energy. I think we are the only party that is saying we need to stop extraction now. Like, we have more oil and gas than we can ever afford to burn, and we absolutely have to be transitioning, and we need to start that now. And we know that there's already people in oil and gas jobs that are transitioning into renewable energy. So we need to just support that and start that at the moment. On jobs, I would also say that we have this big green recovery investment plan, but also investing in our healthcare workers, our social care workers, our education workers is also crucial to our recovery from the pandemic. So it's not just these technical oil and gas jobs. We need to be creating and investing in the people that keep us safe. So we'd be recruiting more teachers. We'd be making sure that nurses are paid better. We'd be making sure that care workers are paid better, that these jobs are attractive and sustainable for people and aren't pushing people. Currently, some of these jobs are pushing people into poverty. There's poverty wages that many care workers work on. So it's sort of two prongs there. Create jobs and make jobs better.
100%. You were talking about hope for the future because we're talking about the end of the planet here. How hopeful are you for the future, that despite all the challenges, it is largely young people that are driving the sort of climate? You've seen the climate strike with the schools, and then when you look at the breakdown of voters, young people overwhelmingly are voting for sort of more progressive left of centre parties. How hopeful are you for the future?
I think you have to be. And I think it's been amazing to see globally all these young people come out and push on this and push really hard on this, and it's working. It is working, and gradually, what we need is governments, multiple governments, all governments, and also the big better regulation of big transnational companies. And those changes it's really hard, but those climate strikers, they have set the wheels in motion. And while 9 years is not long enough, and I do really worry about some of the countries that are going to be where entire bits of population are going to have to move. Because my background's in peace and conflict, the amount of conflict that's been going to be driven when the water in the Nile, the agreement around the amount of water in the Nile doesn't work anymore. Like the amount of conflict that could be driven by this, I think is a real concern to me. But absolutely, we have to have hope, and we can have collective action, and we do have collective action, and we will start pushing things through. And those of us who live in these wealthy, high carbon emitting countries like Scotland, we need to be leading the change, and I think we can.
On the topic of young people, Kate, one of the things that the Greens, as you were talking about successes earlier, last summer displayed in the middle of what could only be described as an exams fiasco was to sort it out, and Ross Greer did a great job in doing that. One of the things that I've noticed in your manifesto is to swap exams for continuous assessments. Could you talk us a wee bit through that and why the Greens think that's a good plan? It's obviously something that wasn't considered pre-pandemic before, but it has shown that there needs to be something in place, and that exams from personal experience doesn't always work for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I really, really feel for the students that are coming through that came through their hires and into university at the beginning of the pandemic. My goodness, like to have your grades messed with and decided on your postcode, which is one of the most discriminatory things I've ever heard of, as someone that went to a pretty rotten, it was a pretty bad comprehensive school in Norwich. That definitely happened, that because it obviously happened in Scotland and England, that happened to all of the people at my school. It's just horrific. And then to turn up to university having got that, so the Greens were obviously the young people themselves led the protests to get those exams results changed, but the Greens then made sure that went through in Parliament. So I'm really proud to be a part of a party that was getting us on the right course on that. And then you turn up to university and you're treated appallingly by the student accommodation. You get trapped in your student accommodation. You can't see your family, or you worry about like going home to see your family at Christmas because if you've got elderly parents. It was just horrific. And then you're paying loads of rent for accommodation that you can't live in. Just awful. Sorry, that's just that's really asking a question. I'm just really, my heart really goes out for everyone that was in that situation. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that we would be doing in terms of dealing with like a student rent, making sure that students don't get stuck in some of those things again. But yes, on education, both at primary and secondary level, for a long time, the Greens have been pushing for a different approach around assessments. So at primary level, we'd be suggesting that children start school at the age of 7. Currently, the early school start in Scotland is a bit of an outlier in Europe. So most European countries start later, and the countries with some of the best education systems, like Finland and Sweden, start at age 7, and then you bring in play-based kindergarten style education before that. So we'd be advocating really heavily for play-based kindergarten education up till 7, and then during primary, massive reduction in the amount of testing, which we believe can have quite a harmful effect on children's attitudes towards learning. And also, like, coming out of the pandemic, we don't want children coming back into, I think this is where it relates to the pandemic. I think we believe that as a principle in general, but coming back from the pandemic, there's a lot of talk about how children have missed out on their, like, the formal aspects of their education, by which people mean tests, and haven't talked about how much children miss out on their social development and all the stuff around, like, learning to play, getting good, like, understanding, like, what it means to be happy, and socializing. So I think that's part of why we're pushing really hard on this now, is that we think that the younger children need to not capture back the missed maths lessons, but capture back that social and personal development time. Yeah, in secondary schools, we'd want to see we'd want to expand sort of continuous assessment of coursework and reduce the role of exams. Absolutely. It's just, I think the pandemic showed, we all knew how stressful those end of year exam times are for people and for people's mental health. And I think, thankfully, so I was doing my A levels like 22 years ago, I don't know, ages ago. And there were no conversations about mental health at that time. It was like my parents are a generation where you don't talk about mental health. No one really talked about mental health at school. I went to a not particularly good school, which meant that there was probably less pressure on academic achievement, which was good. But yeah, you feel at the time like your future is entirely dependent on some maths exam or some English exam that is not about preparing for you for life at all. So it's really about for me, it's really about like reducing like the weight of that on people and giving people and being able to do things in people's own time. Like I'm really lucky because one of my skills is cramming. So I can take an exam. You can give me an exam on something and I can spend 2 days cramming and I'll be fine. But that's not a life skill. That doesn't mean that I'm like any better at critical thinking or any better at like developing relationships with people, or like that you miss out on so much through that, I think. So yeah, I'm really really positive about the Greens approach on this. I'm also, I don't know if you've seen, but we also have like we've been working on this already. So Ross Greer in Parliament has been working on this a lot, but like making sure that personal social education in Scottish schools is much more inclusive, so that there's LGBT plus inclusivity built in to the curriculum, mental health discussions built in, consent-based sex education built in, like all the sort of stuff that was miles away when I was at school. I think this stuff is really important.
You touched there on student rent, and you say that you live in Edinburgh, and although rent is rising across the country, Edinburgh I think is particularly bad for private rent. I think there was an eviction ban over December and January from the Scottish Government. I don't know if that's ended now, I'm not entirely sure, but I think the Greens are for rent controls. Could you go over what that sort of means and how it will help stop or even decrease private rents?
Yeah, sure. So yes, there has been a winter evictions ban during the pandemic. That was a Green policy that we negotiated with the Scottish Government. So we're a little party, but we make really big, really meaningful changes. So the Greens would extend that beyond the pandemic. So we'd have a ban on winter evictions, and we'd also have a completely different system for how landlords are able to do any kind of eviction. So it would be essentially they would need to have legal reasons to make any eviction, not based on what they want to do, essentially. So there's a whole process around evictions, the whole process around, we really need a completely different change of approach in terms of like the balance of rights, because currently landlords are given an awful lot wiggle room than tenants. So the current government, the SNP government, first offered support during the pandemic to landlords, and then Labour and the Greens had to come together and be like, but what about the tenants? What financial support are you offering to the tenants? So we gave financial support to landlords before we gave financial support to tenants. So the power dynamics are all completely wrong. And one of the things that we'd be doing is bringing in a regulator to make sure that all private landlords are regulated, and making sure that everyone, because people, it's not just high rents, it's also like really, really poor quality housing. So people are living in like damp, overcrowded conditions. So making sure that landlords are regulated and also incentivized to maintain their properties properly. Yes, on tackling excessive rent. So yeah, rents are skyrocketing across Scotland, not just where I live in Edinburgh. Edinburgh is particularly bad. I think but not totally unusual. I think rents have gone up before the pandemic. Rents had gone up by about 40%, and the average earnings had gone up by something like 8%. So it's huge differential there. So the Scottish Greens would want to see a bunch of things happen to try and tackle these skyrocketing rents, with the idea that no one should be paying more than 25% of their income on their rent. And yes, we would absolutely bring in a points-based system for rent control. We'd also be regulating short-term lets, because short-term lets don't just take they take housing out of the system, out of the stock, and they push up prices. So Airbnb, so we'd be regulating those. Yeah, and we'd also make sure that tenants had more legal rights to challenge their landlords on rent increases.
Kate, to move away from that and look at one of the other policies, which I think the Greens' position on is very simple. Only 2 of the 96 pages in the manifesto speak about another referendum, which I think is very good compared to the tone that we've seen from one of the newer parties coming to Scottish politics, speaking about supermajorities. The Greens have always been very clear in their message that if there is a majority in the Scottish Parliament, there should be another referendum. What is your position on independence? Why do you think Scotland should be an independent country?
Yeah. So yes, you're quite right. It's fairly straightforward for us. So we support there being an independence referendum at some point during the next 5 years of Parliament. It needs to be after the pandemic. And yeah, we think that the material conditions in Scotland have changed enough since the last one that people have the right to make their own decision on that. So for me, Scottish independence, I'm English, so why do I support Scottish independence? I have family in Scotland and England, and we would be not politically ribbon. We'd be in 2 different countries should we go independent, and yet I still fully support it. So there's a few different reasons. I think for the Greens in general, independence is much more of a means to an end than an end to it in itself. So I think we tend to think about independence quite differently to, say, the SNP. So for us, independence is a lot about our approach to radical grassroots democracy. So independence is about bringing those decisions closer to the people. And then in an independent Scotland, we then want to see decision making devolve down to local government and to community level, which is quite a different approach to the SNP, who are quite a centralised approach. We also think that, well, I'm going to say what I think. I think that independence is the only way in which we can actually make the decisions that we need to make sure that people make sure that we are a country that is progressing our human rights and other people's human rights and our equality. That's my main personal reason. So there's things like that. If we are a devolved parliament, we will never have, I think it's very unlikely we will ever have control over things like immigration policy, which is really, really important to me. I want to be I want to be able to welcome refugees and asylum seekers, and also migrants from all places for all reasons. And I want to not be anywhere near the hostile environment that is being created by the UK government. I think we have a culture coming from government, from the Conservative government, of racism and of racism. And I'd want to see a complete abolition of the Home Office. I think what it's doing is horrific. But also for me, because obviously I work, I work internationally in international development type things. I do not think that we will ever have a human rights based or feminist foreign policy as a UK government. I think we only have an opportunity to do that if we're an independent country. I don't think that we can be part of a global force for peace as part of the UK. when we sell so many weapons. When the UK government, I said that we're all talking about investment as a way out of the pandemic, and one of the things that Boris has done is invest in more nuclear warheads, and refused to increase nurses' salary at the same time. Like, they're those kind of, for me, there's these really big picture decisions that I think as a independent nation we'd be able to, we'd have to work at it, but we would be able to push through like a really different approach. And I think that's also true for the economy. I think we need an economy that's totally different, which is not based on infinite growth, on finite resources, but about wealth, like enhancing wealth equality rather than overall prosperity. And we just don't have the levers on either the economy or quite on energy to be able to tackle the climate change properly, or to be able to tackle like growing inequalities. And actually, I think that the current UK government, although obviously the UK government could change, the direction they're going in is undermining our human rights at the moment, and we need to just completely need to leave.
I totally agree, and even if it was to change party to, say, the Labour Party, defence would almost certainly be reserved in any instance of, say, Devo Max. And with defence reserved, you would have nuclear weapons 30 miles away from Glasgow. So independence would be the only way to get rid of them. When it comes to a referendum in the next 5 years, obviously the Greens have worked with the SNP in all 5 budgets, I think, in the last Parliament. Would you, as a potential Green MSP, be interested in a sort of a formal coalition with the SNP as a sort of progressive alliance, and also a sort of united front for a referendum?
Excellent question. I've just remembered something. The other reason for supporting independence is that I do believe it's our only way back into the EU, and I do think that is an important part of that. I do think in order to tackle climate change in particular, I think we need to be working as part of the EU. Coalition. So our manifesto, our Green Manifesto, that's a programme for government. We ultimately do want to be in government because that would be what would allow us to deliver a transformative programme. But right now, our focus is to get as many green MSPs as possible so that we can have as big an impact as possible. And you mentioned that we've negotiated constructively with the SNP for a few years. So we would want to continue, assuming that we are not the party, the majority party that is elected. We'd want to continue to have that kind of constructive relationship, but with other parties as well. And I wouldn't want to forget like how people are going to vote and what the kind of rejiggling of the amounts of people, the different parties. But at the moment, we just want to get as many Green MSPs into Parliament as possible, so that we can have an impact, regardless of like what the end up mechanism of government is.
Kate, if you're elected to Holyrood in May, what would you like to see from the Parliament in the next 5 years? How big an impact do you think the Greens can have in Parliament, and what direction do you want to take Scotland in the next 5 years?
So many things. So much, so much potential. And currently the polls are saying that we are likely or possible that we might double our numbers in Parliament. So we might go from 5 to 10 or 11, maybe even 12 MSPs, and that would be huge, and that's really, really exciting. And I've talked a little bit about some of the things that we've managed to do in the last Parliament with 5 MSPs. Banning winter evictions, we mentioned, free bus travel for young people, we mentioned, securing a fairer tax system, we mentioned. So all the stuff that we've done with 5 MSPs, like imagine what we'd be able to do with 10 or 11 or 12. Like, this is a really, really exciting prospect. And personally, I'd like to see us in particular, as well as all of the green recovery stuff that we've talked about, I'd also like to see us progressing not just protecting but progressing our human rights and equality in Scotland. So addressing the disproportionate impact that austerity and the pandemic has had on women, of people of colour, of disabled people, and actually looking at gender pay gaps, race pay gaps, making sure that workers are paid properly, that women's work is no longer undervalued and underpaid. I'd also like to see some specific areas of rights progressed. So I'd like to see abortion be decriminalised. I'd like to see trans and non-binary people be able to get legally recognised, and see the reforms of the Gender Recognition Act go through, as well as much better access to healthcare for trans people. I'd like to see a complete, I'm going to say reflection, but like a complete change in attitude in our police and our criminal justice system that actually thinks about and addresses the structural racism that they perpetuate. So there's some really big like human rights and equality issues for me that I would want to see, but they're specific enough that we can make moves on these.
Well, thanks very much for coming on, Kate. And I suppose the only thing to say is, where can people find you?
Oh, so you can find me on, well, you can email me on kate.nevens@scottishgreens.org.uk, and you can also find me on, I think it's edinburghgreens.org.uk online. And you can find me on Facebook, and I'm at Kate Nevens on Twitter. I'm all over the place. I'm very easy to find.
Great stuff.
Well, we both wish you all the best for the 6th of May, Kate, and thank you for joining us on State of Politics.
Thank you so much.